Hey, everybody, and welcome back. This is episode 6 of GCNC Worldview's Cannabis by the Numbers series. And it's been a great time. I was actually looking at some of our numbers, and Beau and Rachel, this series has had the most listenership of any series of podcasts we've done over the last 5 years that Worldview has been recording. So apparently, we found some topics that people really like, or if they don't really like it, it's a necessity nonetheless. So I think it's a little bit of both. Um, for those who are coming in the middle, our guests today are Beau Whitney, who is the CEO, founder, and chief bottle washer over at Whitney Economics, and Rachel Wright, who holds most of those same titles at Verdant Strategies. And we got a treat really, that we don't get a chance often to see everybody together in Las Vegas at MJ BizCon last week. Um, it's pretty timely watching sort of all the shifts and changes in the industry. Being there at the end of the year as people are sort of winding down or planning to ramp up into 2026. Before we jumped into the topic of the day, which is talking about different perceptions of risk and points of view, I wanted to hear from you guys on what you heard at MJ BizCon and what sort of piqued your interest the most from your perspectives on what people were talking about. Rachel, did you want to say hi and maybe start?
Sure, sure. And you forgot the title Cat Herder.
Ah,
Cat Herder.
yes. That's a good one. That one's business card
Chief
worthy.
Cat Herder. Yep. Um, and I also want to say I love GCNC. I love what you're doing here. We've just got to say that you're bringing a lot of great people
Thank
together
you. Thank
um,
you very much.
from a variety of means. And, at the conference, it's great to see everybody in person and things like that. And your monthly meetings are awesome, networking meetings. So I think it's a
Great.
and worthy endeavor, and we love it. And
Thank
effective.
you.
So that being said, I think we're looking at MJ BizCon had a lot of mixed reviews, polarized reviews.
Yeah.
I think obviously, what worked last year isn't going to work this year, isn't going to work next year, and so I think just kind of rethinking things and maybe from all the exhibitor space that we might not need that much in the future. I
Hmm.
think a lot of folks were obviously at all the networking events. They were at all the events surrounding MJ Biz, which is the nature of our industry. It's like relationships, and people can hang out for hours and hours on end and just form those deeper relationships. Everything's relationship oriented. For us personally, it was awesome. From being able to see everybody in person that we always see and deepening those relationships, seeing what you're up to, but then also from seeing clients perspective, we actually saw a lot of operators clients and uh finished a lot of, I'd say closed a lot of deals would be good.
Mm.
And I
Yeah.
heard the
Good.
same. I heard the same. So
Yeah, I think the size of the show, I mean, MJ Biz this year was a GCNC partner for our annual C-suite connector, which was nice. I
mhm.
have felt like um, they have found a pathway to collaboration in much stronger ways this year than they have the last several, and that was great. I think over there they're probably concerned. I don't know what the final numbers were on the show floor, but the energy in Vegas was high for those of us in the industry, but not as many of those people were on the show floor as they'd like, I'm sure. And so I'm sure that's going to be an ongoing discussion. But what I did hear, and this is true also of trends in shows around the world, is that sometimes having fewer people that are more serious helps to create better deals.
Mm.
So some of the exhibitors, for example, that are GCNC members that I talked to were actually pleased about the lower traffic flow because they had more substantive conversations. And I'm hoping that we can figure out as an industry what that delta is, because I like that week every year. I've been going for over 10 years to it and hope that it can continue. Beau, what about you? What was the chatter? I know you were all over the place talking, and I heard at least one speech of yours while I was there.
Yeah, I ended up giving two speeches or participating on two panels. One was on policy and investment, and it looked at both the hemp industry and the marijuana industry, and that was pretty. It was well attended and well received.
Hmm.
The other one was on opportunities in the social equity community, which was also well attended and well received. Um, and people want to know the numbers.
Hmm.
Um, and so I had partnered with First Citizens Bank, and we did a national survey on finance and investment and profitability and the like. And we released our preliminary findings at the conference. And then look for something in Q1. But there's a ray of optimism despite, being kicked and dragged and spit on and all sorts of other stuff.
Hmm.
But there's a level of optimism. So even though what I've described as a race to the starting line, now people are thinking that we're actually at the starting line. And so
Hmm.
that's good. So it took a long time to get there, and a lot of people didn't quite make it from a business perspective. But what it reinforced to me was the importance of community. And so there was, a strong sense of community there, and people were sharing. Even though I did a lot of talking, I also did a lot of listening, and there was still a whole lot to learn. And so there's value in these conferences. There
Hmm.
was a shift I found um, towards international and global. And so there was a lot of discussions on global. We helped co-sponsor a dinner with Grasslands, and it was internationally focused. I know Grasslands is a GCNC partner as well,
Yep.
member. And
Yeah, and we
so,
were a supporter of that event as well. So we brought a
yeah,
lot of our members to it. So absolutely. Yeah.
and so it stressed the importance of, while cannabis is local, it's a local issue, it's also important to think globally. And it
Hmm.
was just reinforced. But there was a lot of discussion on policy and policy impacts, in the US, potential rescheduling, descheduling, or nothing at all.
Hmm.
And then on hemp, there's just a little bit going on with hemp with the redefinition and THC limits and packaging and stuff, which is having widespread implications, not just within the cannabinoid sector, but in fiber and grain as well. And so I talked a lot about international, and I agree that there was a lot of quality in the content, and in those discussions. So it was really robust, rather exhausting, to be quite frank.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I when I talk to people about the international markets, I frequently use the phrase we're geographically agnostic and opportunity centric. So when looking at these flows of international discussion, what I've noticed over the last couple of years as people have gotten more and more nervous about the state of the US market, um, they start to look at the potential of international markets as a risk diversification strategy. Now, those of us who spend a lot of time in the international markets may or may not agree with that, depending on the scenario. But it's interesting to me that a lot of that kind of discussion around, hey, how do I move my company in such a way that if something goes awry over here, I have other things over here. And sometimes that means not to look at another state, but maybe another country or another continent. Um, Today we peg this as a discussion about um, perceived risk and what seems to be the big hole. that people are most concerned about. And you just said, we've got this ray of sunshine coming through. People seem to feel like we've made it to the starting line. At the same time, just a few weeks ago, right, in Congress, there's talks of bans and stopping things and prohibition, which is a never-ending drumbeat. But what I'd like you guys to answer for me is ray of sunshine, bans, prohibition, those two things seem diametrically opposed to each other. And yet I agree with you. I do think optimism is coming into this discussion. Why? Like what is it that's driving the optimism, and what is it that's driving this decrease in perceived risk, and perhaps more opportunity? Or am I just misreading the tea leaves? Rachel, why don't you start first a little bit and say, like, how are your clients perceiving this and feeling it right now, and even how are you feeling, because I know you talk to a lot of people.
Yeah, so I won't speak to the hemp ban so much. I'll let Beau
Right.
talk about that because that's definitely would love to hear about that from you, Beau. Um, I guess what I would say is it really depends on which markets we're looking at. Every market is completely different. So like in California, for example, there's been, I think, there's a lot of operators that are no longer in business, right? So it's given opportunity to the operators that know how to run a business, or they're at least semi decent at running a business. They're here. And so a lot of the noise and competition, even though there's still an illicit market, has been kind of squeezed out.
Okay.
And so we get to see some of the cream rising to the top, I think. And there's still a little bit of ways to go, but also there's a lot of collaboration in that market among operators. So I do like that as well. But then you have in the newer markets, say Northeast, and now you have some other regions kind of popping up online, like the DMV, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia region. Those are really coming online as well. And so everybody's just at a different point in the market. And then you see
Hmm.
Ohio, and obviously all of the newer markets. We still have a long way to go here in the US. And there's a
Hmm.
lot of opportunity here in the US. And so, I think with all the operators that I work with, um, 98% of them are still here, 90,
Hmm.
95% of them are still here. And those are the ones that have continued to operate. So margins are a little bit lower in the older markets. They're still very high in the newer markets. And so, I guess what I would say is we still have a long way to go in this country and a lot of
Hmm.
future ahead of us. And then when it comes to, international markets, obviously Bo could speak to that a lot more, but I do have some clients that are ancillary and they are out there in the EU market, and, it's very, very hopeful. There's so much opportunity. And so I'd say it's very, very hopeful. I've always felt hopeful, except for right after COVID. I would say 2020, 2021 was really, really tough in some areas because COVID caused, a lot of profitability in cannabis businesses because people were buying pizza and buying cannabis. So those were really
Yeah.
good years, right? But after that, I saw a steep decline in businesses, maybe 20%, maybe 30% in gross revenue. So now we're kind of rebounding, but it's very market centric, I'd say. So it's hard to put a broad stroke across any geographical area or any product offering per se.
Yeah, I also have noticed, just out of conversations within the last couple of weeks, Thailand, the story was, well, they went full force and then they backtracked. But as I've talked to operators now there, as that has settled, the response was, yeah, I know that was the storyline, but the truth is it had to happen if we were going to have a regulated and strong ability to grow the market. In Germany, right, there's this discussion about how they've been putting some chokeholds on distribution methods and such, but people who are in it for the long haul the counterpoint has been yes, but it was out of control in the way in which prescriptions were getting made, and it wasn't real, and it certainly wasn't as tightly regulated. There's always details, I guess, within these headlines that, as we start to see what the future holds, is contributing to the rays of sunshine for people who are dedicated to operating in ethical ways, in well-regulated ways, and have a long view. If they're trying to just make a fast buck, probably not great. But if they understand the systems and the markets, there's hope for that. So, anyway, that's my mini soapbox. Beau, how about you? Your thoughts?
Um, it's interesting that Rachel brought up COVID, because, I was just writing about that. A, um, I'm providing expert witness testimony in a legal matter. And so I've been providing these overviews of the US and local markets. And COVID did lull people into a false sense of security, because it was deemed an essential business, in many, many states. But it also forced operators to do more with less. And so you had labor restrictions or distancing requirements, or you were in a retail operation where you couldn't necessarily interface as much or for a long duration with customers. And so it created innovation, that wrung out a lot of the costs. And so people did more with less, more revenue per labor unit, for example. Um, and so investors, looked at that as well. And instead of investing in equity and investing in hope or potential of the market, they started, investing in business fundamentals. And so business fundamentals became super important. And, Rachel's an expert in helping her clients develop processes in, driving efficiencies and business fundamentals. And it's been a critical, skill set to have. And so those, ray of optimism, right? Those are the ones that when the market did reset post-COVID, when consumer behavior changed and not only incorporated, their, per transaction amounts, and they shifted those lower, but then also started becoming more concerned about macro issues like, say inflation. So when the consumer adjusted downward, those that had good operational discipline and good business fundamentals, they were able to adjust as well. Lower margins, of course, but at least they were able to live to fight another day. And so you've got those people with good fundamentals, and there's a less of a perception of risk when it comes to investment. So it having that good business fundamentals and having a good team is really critical because, when you go to get your financing, it's typically at a lower rate. There's less of a risk premium because you have a good team. And so this is like, as you move forward and then you expand into different markets, and Rachel, I couldn't agree more that each market is different. And so you have to look at it discreetly rather than holistically. But I think the most common trait, be it state by state or country by country, is these business fundamentals. And
Mm.
if you have that, then you have a better chance of survival, and you can navigate and develop policies to adjust for, the changing and very dynamic business conditions and regulatory conditions that are present.
Um, as you talk about that, I agree that these elements are what help long-term survivability. And you would think that if that perceived risk in that sense was going down, that the perceived risk amongst groups like bankers and financiers would also go down. Now, I don't know if it's just I've been in the States a little bit more over the last 2 months, and so I've seen more banks floating around, or if
Mhm.
there actually are more banks and financiers getting involved. But um, Rachel, what are you seeing in that front? Do we see bankers loosening up a little bit and getting more active in the market, or is that just me?
No, I see a lot more banks entering the market. That's what it appears to happen. I'm not going to name any institutions here, but there's, some yeah, there's some good institutions that are re-entering the market and coming in with some new energy and new strategies. Um, Especially right now with even some lending products and
Mhm.
loans and working lines of credit that are a little bit more affordable for the operators rather than say bridge loans or very expensive loans
Predatory,
because
yeah.
yeah, kind of more predatory. So like if you're the type of business owner that you can use a 30-day working capital loan and that's like you can actually use it the way the product is meant to be used, great. Like then the loan may make sense just to kind of give you that opportunity for perhaps like orders you would have lost had you not been able to get that inventory. So if you're using a bridge loan for 30 days, the way it's kind of meant to be used, great. But what
Hmm.
happens is people get comfortable with that money and then it ends up going other places that it's not meant to go. And then that becomes a really expensive loan that you're lucky you can pay back, right?
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
so so we just have to look at the loans, look at the purposes, make sure we use them for what they're supposed to be used for. But yes, I see some banks re-entering the market or newer kind of larger institutions coming in with some products that seem to be comparable to what normal businesses would get.
Yeah. Yeah. And that to me is also optimistic. Like, I don't want, having worked in a lot of other industries before I got into cannabis, um, that very discussion that you just brought up about making sure you're using products in the way they were intended was a fairly common discussion, right? We haven't had those discussions in cannabis because you couldn't even get the loans at all. So, um,
One
I
thing
guess
that
that
what
means adult pants are now, able to be worn in the cannabis industry. And I'm happy to see that part of the discussion is coming on. Sorry to cut you off there, but what were you going to say?
Well, one thing that I found interesting though is that you've got banks being somewhat malleable as much as at least they can be. You've got an industry that is pivoting once and twice and dozens of times, but what you don't have are the regulators adjusting to the market. And so the
Mhm.
regulators now are introducing so much risk and even more so than they were previously. And so the regulators are the ones that are creating all these different, well, not all, but they're a major contributor to the dynamics in this market because they're just
Mhm.
not adjusting. And so when they don't adjust and it creates, economic stress within the systems and within their licensees, then the legislators intervene. They're saying, oh my gosh, revenues are going down. We have to increase taxes. And so it just creates these um, policies that are more detrimental to the industry and they're not as supportive as they should be. They're not looking at the health of the operator per se or the business conditions. They're looking at public safety and then, kind of locking in on all that. And I also found banks, they're intrigued by the market because there's all this chatter about marijuana reform,
Mhm.
rescheduling, descheduling. So they're kind of queuing up, but then they get this kind of out of the blue hemp policy that, forces other banks to really tighten up their lending requirements and their due diligence checklists and all this stuff. So it's kind of this, push and pull type of scenario throughout the industry. The ones that are kind of stuck in the mud right now are the regulators, and that's unfortunate because they play such a vital role in this.
And what I could speculate, but what do you think is the cause of that? Because if we're looking at it through a public safety risk lens, um, there's not been any new news in particular to make them more queasy. There's been a lot of propaganda out there, but um, if what we're talking about is in general, the perceived risk for the industry is going down, but regulators aren't getting that message, why not? What is holding that segment up? And I've seen this in Europe and in Latin America as well. So it's not a uniquely US problem, but what do you guys think is driving that?
I think part of this has to do with the legislative mandates, because to a certain extent, regulators are handcuffed by the mandates of the legislatures. And so, and I think it's also an evolution of the the type of people that are creating the policy at the regulatory level. For example, early on in the early days, 2014 through 2018, you had regulators that were very active in this market. They wanted to see the growth and success, and they balanced business conditions with public safety. But now, as those regulators have kind of aged out or retired or been forced out or whatever, I'm from Oregon, so I had to include that. Um, then you've got a situation where you don't have the executive director being a member of national organizations of regulators. You've got a tier one or tier two or tier three administrator being the participants in those. And so,
Hmm.
and their background is typically in public policy and public safety. And so when there's a challenging environment from a regulatory perspective, they tend to default to what they're comfortable with. And so it's a
Hmm.
combination of that comfort factor where their knee-jerk reaction is to drive more towards public safety, and then the legislative mandates that kind of handcuff them as well.
Hmm.
Yeah, I'd
Yeah,
say it's a bit of a myopic viewpoint, right? And so I don't think they're thinking about the business owners and how the business owners benefit the communities and benefit the states and what the business owners need to survive. And so it's just really a very short-sighted way of looking at things, and they really need to take a step back and adopt the viewpoint of also the business owner and take everything into consideration, because the small business
hmm,
owners are obviously the lifeblood of every economy, right? And obviously the
hmm,
people who are the employees as well, but it's the business owners that employ them. And so I think just adopting a different way of looking at things, I don't know if that's ever going to happen, because anybody who gets into policy or government, like asking them to think in a completely different way is very difficult. Maybe it's the way that they're educated. They need to be educated on, business fundamentals. And
right.
I don't know how else to get them to think in ways that benefit business owners, but in general, they really don't think in that way from what I see.
I've been doing a lot of license analysis, state by state, county by county, even zip code by zip code. And there's just a tremendous amount of license saturation out there in the market. And so I talk to these regulators and they say, well, we want to help small businesses and social equity businesses and the like, but their very policy of the saturation is actually hurting those segments of the operators, small business, women-owned business, minority-owned business. They're actually hurting them more and driving them out. And so it
Hmm.
seems very, very interesting. And the reason for that is that there's a lack of interstate commerce. And so if you had a national market versus just a state by state market, then you would have greater opportunity for expansion, for revenue, for, targeted marketing, for specific groups of customers. And you can make really good money just at targeting a specific part of the market. But
Hmm.
without that and the lack of expanding the market, once you're saturated, then it just leads to lower prices, pricing compression, margin compression, and economic distress.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
it would be a really good idea if all of them hired you, Bo. I have to say. I mean,
Well, they're
they really
starting
do
to.
need they do need like a think tank, and like when they decide, how many licenses should be issued in a state and in a certain region, within that state, they should look at how much, how much can that local economy handle reasonably, and it's not like super complex math, I would imagine, right?
Mm-mm.
It's I don't know. I'll leave that to you, Bo, but they really need to employ specialists in that particular area, in an economist area, who can say, okay, this is what this area can handle, and let's not issue more licenses than that. Like, in LA recently, I haven't followed this lately, but they were going to issue just a whole bunch of social equity licenses, and the area can't. And so in Los Angeles, the area can't handle any more licenses. The operators that are there are already struggling. So then they're going to now release a flood of social equity licenses, set those folks up for failure. And so now you have even more people in poverty because they've invested their whole life savings and whatever their friends and family would give them. And now you've even, further exacerbated the issue that you're trying to solve. So like, let's do this in a wise way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's a great takeaway in general that whether we're talking about regulator perspectives or licensure or how we manage our businesses on the day to day, really taking a look at the numbers and not saying, I wish it was like this, but saying, how is it actually? And how do I operate within this to minimize my risk, maximize my opportunity, and help build into the future? As we're sort of winding down and we're looking at closing out the year, um, I know people are starting to think pretty hard or have been thinking for a bit. Now it's really putting the details on it. How am I going to move forward in the coming year? Where are the big moves that I have to make to avoid disaster and create opportunity? Um, what I guess what would be your advice from both of your perspectives on, helping to minimize risk and maximize opportunity into 2026 for these business operators? What are the key one or two things that you would recommend stay top of mind? Beau, you want to start, and then Rachel can close us out.
Um, well, one thing I've been thinking a lot about recently, it has been this pricing compression and oversaturation. I mean, it's been so top of mind. And when I went to MJ Biz, when I went to conferences in the European theater, I mean, everybody's talking about this, even Germany in a call today. And so I've been looking to analyze the conditions in which there's pricing compression and then what that does, how predictable is it? How much of it is saturation versus lack of participation by consumer? And then what that means for flower markets, for vape markets, for edible markets, for beverage markets. And so I'm queuing this up for Q1, Q2 next year to really do a deep dive in this whole concept because nobody's looking at it, right? And so this will be kind of one of those foundational reports. Now, what does that have to do with outlook for the future or anything, right? I think it's important as people are entering into the market to really look at the data and don't assume that there's going to be price increase or stable prices. Build into the models this pricing decline. And for investors, really look at the pitch decks that have this level of sophistication in it. And from a
Mhm.
regulatory and legislative perspective, really take a look at, don't become so reliant on tax revenues and don't anticipate that those tax revenues are going to continue to grow unabated because they're not, they're going to go down. So, and then certainly don't suppress, as regulators and policymakers, don't suppress the growth and opportunities for the operators. So, my advice is when you're entering into this space, business discipline is critical, but then also be very aware of what's going on politically and legislatively and regulatorily because something just could flip a switch and then all of a sudden your opportunity is fundamentally turned on its head. So I think awareness, but then also my final comment is there's a lot of people out there that are in the same boat as everybody else. And so if you work and develop good relationships and partnerships between from one small business to the other, you don't need to be a major MSO in order to be successful and very successful in this market. So developing that sense of community, either through GCNC or through your local groups or what have you, I think that's critically important moving into 2026 and beyond.
Thank you. I like that idea a lot. Thanks for the unpaid plug. Um,
Pack the room at
yeah,
GCNC.
so that's wonderful. Rachel, how about you though? Like as you're looking into the coming year, what takeaways in this category are you conveying to people?
Yeah, I mean, everything, I think Beau covered it really, really well. I'd say, takeaways from MJ Biz and just in the industry in general it is relationships for, you know, supply chain relationships, obviously, but also, learning from the people within your relationships. So say, for example, if you're surrounded by professionals, make sure you ask those professionals in their area of expertise, what exactly are you doing to help clients? Because every professional is going to have a different take on that, and they're going to see a different segment of the market, and they're going to see a different slice of the challenge that these operators have to face. So for example, if I'm talking to, say, a merchant processor, they're going to have some really, really good insights that I need to be able to share with my clients. And they may have a new solution that I haven't heard of. Or say an insurance provider, they may have a new product that's super helpful and could save a business. And so I'd
Mhm.
say, for us service professionals relying on those communities, I can't tell you how often some of my clients who are operators and they live in the operator world and those are their connections, they're living in one side of the world and they may say, oh, well, for example, I don't think any capital is coming into the market. Well, that might be what the other operators are saying, but I happen to know something different because I live in a different circle. I live in other circles. So I would say look
Mhm.
outside your relationship circle. I think that that's really, really important, because there's so much movement happening in this industry and so many innovations happening every day,
Yeah.
and so many changes that we have to stay tuned and tapped in. And that's how we learn.
Yep. I love that. And I have found even with the community that we've created and as extensive as it is, that oftentimes realizing that the same question is being asked in all these different markets about the unknowns is as valuable as having the answers. Because if you know what the questions are for groups, even though they may feel like they're in silos, all of a sudden you can start to amplify the way in which you solve to them and find those answers. And the capital example is perfect, right? I've been in a lot of rooms where people say capital just isn't flowing. Where can I find some? And yet I've also been in just enough rooms in other places to know that it is available.
Yeah.
But you have to know where to look and present responsibly and without hype and professionally and all of that. It's a great example of, yeah, just have things locked down and source your networks and the professionals around you to make sure you're doing things the best way you possibly can. Um, so, on that note, I think I'm going to wrap us up and thank everybody for continuing to listen to Cannabis by the Numbers on GCNC Worldview. We've got one more joint session coming up here in a couple of weeks that we're excited to get in front of everyone as we truly wrap up the year. Um, so keep listening, keep checking it out. Again, Beau and Rachel, thank you very much for your continued participation and dedication to these sessions. I certainly appreciate it, and I know the people out there listening do as well. So thanks, everybody. Until next time.